She was only holding an old painting of a horse. When her children called her a burden and walked away, no one imagined that simple object held something that would change everything. Gray Kentucky skies loomed over the Oak Ridge retirement home, their heaviness mirrored in Eleanor Martinez's tired eyes as she gazed through the foggy window of her small room. The 68-year-old woman's trembling fingers, a permanent reminder of the stroke that had brought her here, caressed the worn canvas on her lap. The painting depicted a magnificent black Mustang, its mane flowing wild as it galloped across an open plain. Though the colors had faded with time, Eleanor's connection to it remained vivid, a portal to her previous life when her gentle touch could calm the wildest thoroughbreds in Kentucky's elite stables. Those hands, her father Miguel would say in Spanish, tienen magia, have magic. Those same hands had once guided nervous Derby contenders through pre-race jitters, though her name never appeared in any official record. Undocumented workers didn't get credit, only the risk of deportation. Eleanor sighed, her breath creating a small circle of condensation on the cold glass. Outside, winter was reluctantly giving way to spring, but the trees remained skeletal, hesitant to trust the changing season. Mi pequeña susurradora, her father would call her proudly, my little whisperer, teaching her the equestrian traditions passed down through generations of the Martinez family in Guadalajara. Memories flickered through her mind. Her father lifting her onto a gentle mare when she was barely 6 years old, just months before they crossed the border. The smell of hay and leather in the stables where they found work. The constant fear that shadowed their existence. A sharp knock interrupted her reverie. Medication time, Mrs. Martinez. Nurse Patel entered without waiting for a response, her white shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. And please, don't start with those horse stories again. You got the other residents all worked up last time. Eleanor accepted the small paper cup of pills with a slight nod. The horses were real, Nurse Patel. As real as you and me. The nurse's expression softened momentarily. I'm sure they were, Mrs. Martinez. Just like my grandfather's stories about tigers in his village. We all have our memories. She glanced at her watch. Don't forget your physical therapy at 3. As the door closed, Eleanor's gaze drifted to the small table beside her bed where 3 framed photographs stood in a neat row. Her children, all successful executives with pressed suits and practiced smiles. Alejandro, the oldest, worked for a consulting firm in Chicago. Maria managed a tech company in Seattle. Carlos, her youngest, had recently been promoted at his banking job in Atlanta. Mama, we can't take care of you and our careers at the same time, Alejandro had explained when they'd brought her to Oak Ridge 6 months ago. This place has excellent reviews. What he meant was that it was the best they could afford while still maintaining their comfortable lifestyles. Eleanor placed her painting on the bed and struggled to her feet, wincing as her stiff knee protested. Using her cane for support, she made her way slowly toward the common room where most residents gathered in the afternoons. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and yesterday's meatloaf, the sterile scent a far cry from the earthy aromas of stables that had surrounded her for most of her life. In the common room, several residents sat in wheelchairs or padded chairs, arranged in a semicircle around a flat-screen television mounted on the wall. Some dozed with chins resting on chests. Others stared vacantly at the screen, where a soap opera played at low volume. Eleanor found an empty chair near the back and eased herself into it. Breaking news from the racing world, announced a reporter as the program cut to a local news segment. Eleanor's attention sharpened, her body instinctively leaning forward. The camera panned across an impressive estate with white fences and manicured pastures. Texas billionaire Travis Blackwell, heir to the Blackwell racing empire, has acquired Midnight Storm for $4 million, described as the greatest promise in the racing circuit. The scene shifted to a tall, square-jawed man in his 40s, dressed in an expensive suit despite the stable setting behind him. Midnight Storm has championship bloodlines, Blackwell stated confidently. We have high expectations for the upcoming season. However, continued the reporter, sources say the thoroughbred has become dangerously aggressive after witnessing the violent death of his trainer in a training accident 3 weeks ago. The footage cut to a stable manager with a weathered face and concerned eyes. "We've tried everything," he admitted, tugging at his cap. "Specialists from 5 different states. This animal is worth millions, but he's becoming a lost cause." The camera then focused on a magnificent black horse confined in an isolated stall. Even through the electronic barrier of the television, Eleanor could see the terror in the animal's eyes. Wide, white-rimmed, and filled with a primal fear she recognized immediately. It wasn't aggression that drove the horse's behavior. It was trauma. "Ese caballo no está loco, está asustado," Eleanor murmured, rising slowly with the help of her cane as tears welled in her wrinkled eyes. "That horse isn't crazy. He's frightened." Something in the magnificent animal's expression connected with her own abandonment, her own loneliness. On the screen, Midnight Storm's eyes seemed to meet hers, as if pleading for help across the electronic divide. The other residents barely noticed as Eleanor shuffled back to her room, her heart pounding with purpose for the first time in months. Once inside, she carefully locked her door, a small rebellion against the home's open-door policy, and sat on her bed, examining her old painting under the weak light of her bedside lamp. "Perhaps there's one last horse to save, viejo amigo," she whispered to the Mustang in the painting. That night, sleep eluded Eleanor. Instead, she meticulously planned her escape, or at least a temporary absence that wouldn't result in immediate search parties. She knew Nurse Wilson had Thursday off, and the replacement was always a young man who spent more time on his phone than monitoring residents. The medication rounds happened at 9, and lunch wasn't until noon. That gave her a 3-hour window. For the next 2 days, Eleanor observed the retirement home's routines with renewed attentiveness, noting staff changes and security gaps. She discovered that the side entrance near the laundry room was often propped open on delivery days. Thursdays, coincidentally. When Thursday arrived, Eleanor dressed carefully in her best outfit, a simple blue dress with a cardigan, and placed her painting in a protective cloth bag. After taking her morning medication, she waited patiently until she saw the young attendant settle at the nurse's station, already absorbed in his phone. "I'm going to sit in the garden for a while," she informed him as she passed. "The doctor said sunshine would be good for me." "Sure thing, Mrs. M," he replied without looking up. "Just be back for lunch, okay?" The garden path led conveniently past the laundry entrance, which, as she'd anticipated, was propped open with a brick while deliveries were being made. With a casual glance around, Eleanor slipped through the door and out into the parking lot beyond. Her heart raced as she walked to the main road and hailed a taxi, an extravagance she'd budgeted for by saving her small monthly allowance. "Jefferson Street Apartments, please," she directed the driver, giving the address of the small apartment where she'd lived before the stroke. The apartment her children still maintained, partly out of guilt, and partly because they couldn't agree on what to do with her belongings. 20 minutes later, Eleanor stood in her dusty living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes and sheet-covered furniture. In the cramped parking space behind the building sat her 1998 Ford Fiesta, kept against her children's advice to sell it. "Let's see if you still have some life in you, too," she murmured to the car as she found the keys in their hiding place inside a ceramic horse on the mantel. The engine coughed reluctantly before sputtering to life. Eleanor placed her painting on the back seat and a printed map of Blackwell Acres on the passenger seat. The GPS on her old phone had stopped working months ago, but Eleanor preferred paper maps anyway. They never lost signal or ran out of battery. As she drove slowly but determinedly through the Kentucky countryside, memories flooded back. Crossing the border at 6 years old, clutching her father's hand, watching her parents being led away in handcuffs during an immigration raid when she was 16, the kindness of a stable family who took her in, recognizing her special gift with troubled horses. For decades, Eleanor had worked illegally in the shadows of the Kentucky Derby, her hands healing horses others considered beyond help. She never received public recognition, but trainers and owners knew whom to call when a valuable thoroughbred became unmanageable. "Send for the Mexican woman," they'd say, "the one with the quiet voice." After 40 miles of driving, the imposing gates of Blackwell Acres appeared ahead. Eleanor slowed the Fiesta, noting the security cameras and intercom system. Two uniformed guards stood at attention, their eyes narrowing at the approaching vehicle, a stark contrast to the luxury cars that typically visited the estate. Eleanor stopped at the checkpoint, rolling down her window with effort. "Can I help you, Mom?" asked one guard, bending slightly to peer into the car, his expression a mixture of suspicion and confusion at the sight of the elderly Mexican woman in her modest dress. "I'm here to see Mr. Blackwell about Midnight Storm," Eleanor replied with surprising authority, her accent thickening slightly with nervousness. The guards exchanged glances. "Do you have an appointment?" the second guard asked. "No," Eleanor admitted, "but I saw the horse on television. I can help him." The first guard straightened, his hand moving to rest on his radio. "I'm sorry, ma'am, this is private property. Without an appointment. Tell Mr. Blackwell that Eleanor Martinez is here to help Midnight Storm," she interrupted with quiet dignity, her trembling hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I know the silent language this horse needs to hear." The guard's expression softened slightly. Perhaps it was the conviction in her voice, or maybe just pity for the confused old woman he assumed she was. After a brief radio exchange that included muffled laughter from the other end, he turned back to Eleanor. "Wait here," he instructed before walking away to confer with his colleague. Minutes later, a robust man in his 50s approached, wearing a plaid shirt with the Blackwell Racing logo embroidered on the pocket. His weathered face suggested years spent outdoors with horses. "Mrs. Martinez?" he asked, studying her with poorly disguised skepticism. "I'm Hank Wilson, property manager. I understand you think you can help with our situation." Eleanor nodded. "I've worked with traumatized horses for 50 years, Mr. Wilson. I saw Midnight Storm on the news. He's not aggressive. He's terrified." Hank's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, we've had specialists from all over the country try their luck. 4 got injured." He hesitated, then shrugged. "But Mr. Blackwell said to let you through. Apparently, he's curious." A moment later, to Eleanor's surprise, the massive iron gates began to swing open. "You have 15 minutes, Mrs. Martinez," Hank said, handing her a clipboard with a form. "I need you to sign this liability waiver. If anything happens, Blackwell Racing takes no responsibility." Eleanor signed with her trembling hand without reading the document. "I won't need more than that for the first day," she stated confidently, though her heart pounded in her chest. As Hank escorted her car through the property, Eleanor caught glimpses of the main mansion through the trees, a sprawling colonial-style building with massive white columns. From its panoramic windows, though she couldn't see him, Travis Blackwell observed the unusual scene, intrigued enough by the elderly Mexican woman with a painting under her arm to watch what he assumed would be another failed attempt with his $1 million investment. "Tell Mr. Blackwell that Eleanor Martinez is here to help Midnight Storm," she declared with surprising dignity to the skeptical guard. "I know the silent language this horse needs to hear." And to her own surprise, the gates began to open slowly. The gates of Blackwell Acres swung open with reluctant hospitality, metal hinges creaking as if announcing an intruder rather than a guest. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel of her old Ford Fiesta, surprised that her improvised speech had actually worked. As she guided her car through the entrance, she caught Hank Wilson studying her through the rearview mirror, his weathered face a map of skepticism. "The stables are just ahead," he directed, pointing toward an impressive complex of white buildings with green trim. "Most staff steer clear of the isolation barn where we keep Midnight Storm. For good reason." Eleanor nodded silently, taking in the manicured landscape of Kentucky bluegrass and pristine white fences that stretched to the horizon. Blackwell Acres represented everything her family had worked around but never within, the visible face of an industry that relied on invisible hands like hers. "Park over there," Hank instructed, gesturing to a small lot near the largest stable. As Eleanor carefully maneuvered into a space, she noticed a group of stable hands pausing their work to observe her arrival, their expressions ranging from curiosity to amusement. "Don't mind them," Hank said as he helped her from the car, his kindness seemingly at odds with his skepticism. "They've seen every horse whisperer and trainer in 5 states come through here. None lasted more than an hour with that beast." Eleanor retrieved her painting from the back seat, holding it protectively against her chest. "He's not a beast, Mr. Wilson. He's in pain." Hank offered no response as he led her toward a separate structure set apart from the main stables. A red sign on the door proclaimed, "Danger, no unauthorized access," in bold letters. Through the expansive windows of the main house overlooking the property, Travis Blackwell observed the unusual visitor with a mixture of amusement and curiosity, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the rustic setting of his empire. "I should warn you," Hank said as they approached the isolation barn. "This horse killed his previous trainer. Well, not directly. The man fell and hit his head during a training session gone wrong, but Midnight Storm watched it happen. Hasn't been the same since." He paused, hand on the door. "Some say animals don't understand death. I disagree." "Animals understand more than most people think," Eleanor replied softly. Inside, the isolation barn was eerily quiet compared to the busy main stables. The air hung heavy with the scent of hay, leather, and the distinct muskiness of a troubled horse. The building housed 6 stalls, but only one was occupied. At the far end, behind reinforced bars rather than the typical half-doors, stood Midnight Storm. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see he was magnificent. 16 hands of gleaming black coat and powerful muscle, his lineage evident in his proud head and strong hindquarters. But his beauty was marred by the terror in his eyes and the tension evident in every line of his body. "Stay back from the bars," Hank warned as several stable hands filtered in behind them, mobile phones discreetly raised. He charged the last specialist who got too close, nearly took the man's arm off. Eleanor noted the gathering audience with a frown. "Too many people," she murmured. "Too much tension." Hank shrugged. "They're curious, and if something happens, I need witnesses that you were warned." At the sound of their voices, Midnight Storm retreated to the back of his stall, ears pinned flat against his head, eyes wide with what Eleanor recognized immediately as fear, not aggression. His powerful body trembled slightly, muscles tensed for fight or flight. "I'll need a chair," Eleanor said calmly, never taking her eyes off the horse. "A simple bench, if you have one." Hank looked confused but nodded to one of the stable hands, who returned moments later with a wooden bench. Eleanor positioned it about 10 feet from the stall, far enough to give the horse space, but close enough to establish presence. "You're not going to try to go in?" asked one of the younger hands, disappointment evident in his voice. "No," Eleanor replied as she carefully lowered herself onto the bench. "Not today." With deliberate slowness, she positioned her painting on her lap, facing the horse rather than the audience. The image of the running Mustang seemed to catch Midnight Storm's attention, his ears flickering forward momentarily before flattening again. The gathered staff exchanged glances of confusion and barely suppressed amusement. One older man whispered something that made others chuckle. Eleanor ignored them completely, her focus entirely on the traumatized animal before her. Then, to everyone's surprise, she began to sing. A soft, gentle rendition of Amazing Grace, her voice carrying the melody with the slight tremor of age, but a sweetness that filled the tense silence of the barn. After the first verse, she seamlessly transitioned into speaking Spanish, her voice dropping to a conversational tone as if she and the horse were the only ones present. "Sabe, mi hermoso," she said, as though chatting with an old friend. "When I was 10 years old in Guadalajara, my father found a foal nearly dead in the desert. It had been attacked by coyotes and abandoned by the herd. Nobody believed it would survive." The stable hands looked at each other in bewilderment as the elderly woman continued her story, alternating between soft singing and gentle Spanish narration. Minutes passed with no dramatic interaction, no sudden movements toward the stall, no obvious technique being applied. "What exactly is she doing?" one of them whispered. "Wasting our time," another replied, though he made no move to leave. In the stall, however, something subtle was changing. Midnight Storm remained at the back, still alert and wary, but his breathing had slowed slightly. His ears, while not completely forward, were no longer pinned back in aggression. His eyes, still wide, tracked Eleanor's movements with alert intelligence rather than blind panic. Eleanor continued her story, describing how her father had nursed the wounded foal back to health, speaking of horses she had known and loved throughout her life. Her voice never rose above a gentle murmur, creating a bubble of calm in the tense environment. After precisely 15 minutes, Hank returned, clearly expecting to find either disaster or disappointment. Instead, he found an unusual tableau of stillness, the elderly woman speaking softly, the dangerous horse watching her with what appeared to be tentative interest, and the stable hand standing in uncharacteristic silence. "Time's up, Mrs. Martinez," Hank announced, breaking the spell. Eleanor nodded, finishing her sentence before carefully rising from the bench with her painting. "Tomorrow I will return," she said simply, addressing the horse rather than Hank. "We have only begun." As she turned to leave, Midnight Storm shifted his weight forward slightly, taking a single step toward the front of the stall before catching himself and retreating. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but the experienced stable hands noticed immediately. "Did you see that?" one whispered to another. He moved toward her. "Probably just wanted to charge," the other replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Hank escorted Eleanor back to her car, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "That was different," he admitted, "though I'm not sure what it accomplished. First meetings are about establishing presence, not demanding response," Eleanor explained as she carefully placed her painting in the back seat. "He needs to remember how to trust." Hank studied her with newfound curiosity. "Where did you learn to work with horses, Mrs. Martinez?" A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. "In the places your industry doesn't see, Mr. Wilson. The back barns, the training tracks at dawn, the holding pens where the injured wait to be discarded." She met his gaze directly. 50 years cleaning stalls and healing the broken ones teaches you to listen when animals speak without words." Something in her directness made Hank shift uncomfortably. "Well, you're welcome to try again tomorrow, I suppose. Mr. Blackwell seems intrigued." "Gracias," Eleanor replied with dignity. "I will be here at the same time." As she drove away, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The first contact had gone better than she had dared hope. Midnight Storm was indeed traumatized, but not beyond reach. His response to her voice, subtle though it was, confirmed what she had suspected from the television footage. This was not an aggressive animal, but one locked in the prison of his own terror. In the days that followed, Eleanor established a routine that defied her health limitations and the skepticism of those around her. Each morning she would escape the retirement home using increasingly creative excuses, drive to Blackwell Acres, and spend exactly 1 hour with Midnight Storm. Her approach remained consistent, sitting quietly, telling stories, singing occasionally, never pushing for interaction. By the 4th day, a small group of stable hands had become regular observers, their initial mockery giving way to genuine curiosity. Jason, a young groom in his mid-20s with intelligent eyes and a gentle way with horses, began to ask questions after each session. "I don't understand how you can just sit there and do nothing," he admitted after watching Eleanor's 5th visit, during which Midnight Storm had actually remained at the front of his stall for several minutes. "I am not doing nothing, young man," Eleanor replied with a smile. "I am speaking his language, the language of patience and respect." On her 6th visit, Eleanor brought a red apple, sliced into pieces. With the same deliberate movements that characterized all her interactions, she placed a slice in her trembling palm and extended it through the bars. Midnight Storm retreated immediately, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar scent. The stable hands watching held their breath, some preparing to document another failure. "Today, no. Quizás mañana," Eleanor said naturally, withdrawing her hand without disappointment. Instead of forcing the issue, she simply placed the apple slice on the ground near the front of the stall and continued her story about a palomino she had once helped recover from a trailer accident. The horse watched her intently, nostrils still flared, eyes tracking every movement. When Eleanor finally rose to leave, something remarkable happened. As she turned away, Midnight Storm cautiously approached the bars, stretching his neck to sniff at the discarded apple slice. He didn't eat it, but the investigation itself represented a monumental shift in his behavior, a fact not lost on the growing audience of stable hands. "See you tomorrow, mi hermoso," Eleanor said softly as she departed, her heart lighter than it had been in months. As she drove back to Oakridge Retirement Home, Eleanor reflected on the progress of these first sessions. Trust was a delicate bridge built one plank at a time. Midnight Storm was testing the first planks, finding them solid enough to warrant further exploration. The real work, the deep healing, lay ahead, but the foundation was being laid with each quiet exchange. What Eleanor didn't know was that her unusual methods had become the subject of intense discussion throughout Blackwell Acres. Travis Blackwell himself had begun reviewing security footage of her sessions, his initial amusement evolving into reluctant interest as he observed the subtle changes in his valuable investment's behavior. "It's just coincidence," he insisted to Hank during their evening briefing. "The horse is adjusting to his environment, that's all." "Maybe," Hank replied thoughtfully. "But I've never seen anyone approach a traumatized thoroughbred quite like she does. It's like she's having a conversation only they can hear." The next morning, as Eleanor settled onto her bench for the 7th session, she was aware of an additional observer, Travis Blackwell himself, standing at a distance, arms crossed over his expensive suit, watching with poorly disguised skepticism. She acknowledged him with a slight nod before turning her full attention to Midnight Storm, who greeted her with a soft nickering sound that made several stable hands exchange looks of astonishment. "Buenos dias to you too," Eleanor responded with a smile, unfolding a new story about the wild horses of her childhood. As Eleanor walked away later that day, Midnight Storm took several steps forward, following her with his gaze, a small gesture that didn't escape the experienced stable hands, who exchanged looks of astonishment, and in the silence of the barn, the imposing black animal released a soft whinny that sounded almost like a question. The questioning whinny from Midnight Storm lingered in Eleanor's mind as she drove back to Oakridge that evening, a sound that seemed to bridge the vast distance between species, a tentative hello from a creature who had forgotten how to trust. That small vocalization, more than any dramatic gesture, confirmed what Eleanor already knew. Healing had begun, but the journey would be long and fragile. Over the next few days, Eleanor established a dangerous routine, slipping away from the retirement home 3 times weekly to visit Blackwell Acres. Each escape required increasingly elaborate planning as the staff began noticing her absences. Nurse Wilson had started checking her room more frequently, and the administrator had left a friendly reminder about the facility's sign-out policy on her bedside table. "Where do you disappear to on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Mrs. Martinez?" asked Nurse Patel during morning medication rounds. "The physical therapist says you've missed 2 appointments this week." "Just visiting old friends," Eleanor replied, accepting her pills with a steady gaze that discouraged further questioning. It wasn't entirely a lie. Midnight Storm was becoming the closest friend she'd had in years. Each morning before her visits, Eleanor studied her old painting of the Mustang, using it to center herself. The artwork had become more than a memento. It was a talisman connecting her to a lifetime of silent communication with animals others had dismissed as lost causes. During her 3rd visit that week, Eleanor arrived at Blackwell Acres with a small paper bag tucked alongside her painting. Jason, the young groom who had taken an interest in her methods, was waiting near the entrance to the isolation barn. "Morning, Mrs. Martinez," he greeted her with genuine warmth. "He's been restless today, keeps looking toward the door." "Waiting is also communication," Eleanor replied with a smile. "It means he remembers." Inside, Midnight Storm's demeanor had indeed changed. Though still alert and cautious, he no longer retreated to the back of his stall at her approach. Instead, he stood watching, his ears moving between forward attention and sideways uncertainty, the equine equivalent of curiosity fighting with fear. Eleanor settled onto her bench, positioning her painting as always. From her paper bag, she withdrew a small red apple, quartered it with a paring knife, and placed the pieces on a handkerchief on her lap. "In Mexico," she began softly in Spanish, "my father taught me that food is never just food between friends. It is trust made visible. She extended her trembling hand with a piece of apple through the bars. Midnight Storm flinched, taking 2 quick steps backward. His nostrils flared as he caught the sweet scent, but memory and trauma held him firmly in place. "Today, no, quizás mañana," Eleanor said naturally, withdrawing her hand without disappointment or pressure. With deliberate movements, she placed the apple piece on the ground just inside the stall entrance, then continued her story as if the rejection were merely a pause in conversation rather than failure. Several stable hands watching from a distance exchanged knowing looks, their expressions clearly communicating. Another wasted effort. But Eleanor understood what they did not, that healing moved at its own pace, and forcing it only created the illusion of progress. For 30 minutes, she continued her gentle monologue, sharing stories of horses she had known throughout her life. Though most of the observers eventually drifted away to attend to other duties, Jason remained, watching with quiet intensity from the corner. As Eleanor prepared to leave, she gathered her belongings without looking directly at the apple slice still lying untouched on the ground. "Until tomorrow, mi hermoso," she said softly. "Sleep well with good dreams." Only Jason noticed what happened next. As Eleanor walked away, Midnight Storm cautiously approached the front of his stall. With delicate precision, he stretched his neck and sniffed at the apple piece. Though he didn't eat it, his investigation, tentative and fearful as it was, represented a monumental shift in his behavior. "He checked it out," Jason reported excitedly when he caught up with Eleanor in the parking lot. "After you left. He didn't eat it, but he wasn't afraid to look." Eleanor smiled. "The first taste is always with the eyes and nose, young man. He's remembering how to be curious instead of fearful." The following morning, Eleanor woke with a sharp pain shooting through her left arm, a reminder that her body was still recovering from the stroke that had landed her in Oak Ridge. The rational choice would have been to rest, to skip her visit to the stables. Instead, she doubled her pain medication, wrapped her arm in a supportive sleeve beneath her cardigan, and proceeded with her escape plan. By her 4th visit that week, word had spread throughout Blackwell Acres about the elderly Mexican woman and her unconventional approach. The audience had grown to include not just stable hands but exercise riders, and even 2 trainers from the main facility, all watching with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. "You know you could make this go faster with proper equipment," suggested one trainer, a tall man with a championship belt buckle and impatient eyes. "A lead rope, maybe a light crop to establish boundaries." "His boundaries were violated when he watched his person die," Eleanor replied quietly. "He doesn't need more boundaries. He needs to remember that connection doesn't always end in pain." She settled onto her bench, aware of the whispers around her but focused entirely on the magnificent animal before her. Midnight Storm stood closer to the front of his stall today, his attention fixed on Eleanor from the moment she entered. Again, she offered a piece of apple in her outstretched palm. Again, he declined, though with less dramatic retreat than before. And again, she placed it on the ground without commentary before continuing her stories. When Eleanor departed an hour later, she left behind not just one apple piece but a small trail of them, creating a pathway from the back of the stall toward the front. "A roadmap home," she explained to Jason, who had become her unofficial assistant. That evening, returning to Oak Ridge with the scent of horses still clinging to her clothes, Eleanor found the director waiting in her room, a clipboard in hand and a concerned expression on her face. "Mrs. Martinez, your absences have been noted," the woman began formally. "This is dangerous in your condition. If you continue leaving without proper authorization, we'll need to notify your children and consider more restrictive measures." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "I am not a prisoner, Director Simmons. I'm a patient who occasionally visits friends. Friends with very large hooves, according to your clothes," the director replied with a raised eyebrow. "We're responsible for your safety. Your children entrusted us with your care." The threat hung in the air between them. More restrictions, perhaps even a transfer to the secure wing where doors remained locked and residents were monitored constantly. Eleanor nodded with feigned contrition, knowing that tomorrow she would risk everything again. Some calls echoed too deeply to be ignored. even at the cost of what little freedom remained to her. On her fifth visit, Eleanor noticed a new observer, Travis Blackwell himself, standing at a calculated distance, his expensive loafers carefully positioned to avoid stable debris. Unlike the trainers and grooms, he made no attempt to disguise his scrutiny, watching with the analytical gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating assets rather than understanding beings. Eleanor acknowledged him with a slight nod, before turning her full attention to Midnight Storm, who greeted her with a soft nickering sound that made several stable hands exchange looks of astonishment. Her routine remained unchanged. Stories, songs, offered apple pieces that Midnight Storm still approached but wouldn't take directly from her hand. Travis observed the entire session, his expression evolving from skepticism to reluctant interest as he noted the horse's attentive posture, so different from the defensive aggression he had displayed with professional trainers. When Eleanor rose to leave, Travis approached her, maintaining what he clearly considered a respectful distance. "Ms. Martinez, I've been watching your technique." His voice carried the carefully modulated tone of wealth accustomed to being heard. "I'm curious, what exactly is your secret?" Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. The question wasn't entirely dismissive. There was genuine curiosity beneath his corporate veneer. "No hay secretos, señor. Only respect and patience. Your horse doesn't need to be dominated. He needs to be heard." Travis frowned, clearly unsatisfied with her answer. "We've had the best trainers in the country try their methods. This animal represents a significant investment." "Algunos tesoros no pueden ser comprados, Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor replied with quiet dignity. "His trust has no price." The exchange hung between them, highlighting the fundamental disconnect in their approaches, one seeing a valuable asset requiring efficient management, the other recognizing a wounded soul needing compassionate healing. On her sixth visit, Eleanor arrived to find an unusual level of excitement among the stable staff. Jason hurried to meet her as she parked her car, his expression animated. "You have to see this, Mrs. Martinez," he said, leading her toward the isolation barn. "I came in early to muck out his stall and found something amazing." Inside, Midnight Storm greeted Eleanor with a soft nicker that seemed almost like recognition. But what caught her attention was the floor of his stall. Every apple piece she had left the previous day was gone. "He ate them all sometime during the night," Jason explained, his voice hushed with wonder. "The night guard said he heard movement around 2 in the morning, but when he checked, Midnight Storm was just standing there, calm as could be." Eleanor felt tears welling in her eyes. Such a small victory might seem insignificant to others, but she understood its profound meaning. Midnight Storm had engaged with her offering on his own terms, in his own time, when no human eyes were watching. It was the first autonomous choice he had made since the trauma. That day, when Eleanor offered the apple piece in her trembling palm, she made one subtle change. Instead of extending her arm through the bars, she simply held her hand flat against her side, the apple visible but requiring Midnight Storm to approach on his own initiative. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The stable hands watching began to drift away, assuming the previous progress had been coincidental. Only Jason remained, filming discreetly on his phone from a corner of the barn. Then, with exquisite caution, Midnight Storm took 3 steps forward. His ears flicked nervously, his muscles tensed for immediate retreat, but something stronger than fear drew him toward Eleanor. With infinite gentleness, he stretched his neck and delicately took the apple piece from her palm, his velvet lips brushing against her skin for the briefest moment before he retreated to chew his prize. The touch was fleeting, barely more than a whisper of contact, but its significance was monumental. Jason's phone captured the exact moment, his suppressed gasp audible on the recording as he realized he was witnessing what many had deemed impossible. That evening, as Eleanor drove home with tears of joy still damp on her cheeks, Jason uploaded the video to his social media accounts with the caption, "The horse whispering grandma, impossible became reality today at Blackwell Acres. The demon horse takes food from her hand." The horse whisperer, your Midnight Storm, miracle worker. By morning, the video had gone viral within Kentucky's equestrian community, gathering thousands of views and hundreds of comments from professional trainers, horse owners, and enthusiasts across the state. The elderly Mexican woman with trembling hands had accomplished what experts with decades of formal training had failed to achieve. What none of them yet realized was that this small moment of connection, a piece of apple passed from human to horse, represented merely the first tentative plank in a bridge that would ultimately transform not just Midnight Storm, but everyone whose life he touched. That night, in his elegantly appointed office illuminated only by the crystal desk lamp, Travis Blackwell made a decisive phone call. "Richard, Travis here. I need you to come to Kentucky immediately. I have a valuable horse I can't afford to lose because of an old Mexican woman's slow methods." "Yes, bring all your equipment. We're going to do this the traditional way." The sharp ring of Travis Blackwell's desk phone cut through the silence of his office as he completed his call to Richard Thornton. He replaced the receiver with a satisfied smile, confident that the situation with Midnight Storm would soon be resolved through proper professional methods. The elderly Mexican woman's approach had shown minimal results, and time was money in the racing industry. The Kentucky Derby qualification races were approaching, and Travis couldn't afford to waste a $4 million investment on gentle whispers and apple slices. 3 days later, a gleaming black Range Rover pulled up to the main entrance of Blackwell Acres. Richard Thornton stepped out, his tall frame clad in pristine boots and a custom-tailored riding jacket that advertised his success without saying a word. 2 assistants followed, unloading equipment from the back of the vehicle: specialized bits, training whips, ropes, and a saddle that represented the latest in equine control technology. "Travis," Thornton called, embracing the owner with the familiar confidence of old acquaintances. "Good to see you. Where's this problem horse I've been hearing about?" Travis led him toward the isolation barn, explaining the situation in terse business terms: acquisition cost, potential stud value, timeline for racing season, and the setbacks caused by the training accident. He made no mention of Eleanor Martinez until they were nearly at the barn door. "There's this elderly woman who's been coming around," Travis said with a dismissive wave. "Some kind of folk healer or something. The staff seem impressed with her, but we need real results, not parlor tricks." Thornton laughed. "I've seen it all, Travis. Every wealthy owner eventually gets taken in by some horse whisperer who talks about energy and connection. Meanwhile, the horse is just learning he can get away without working." He patted one of the specialized bits hanging from his belt. "My methods have produced 17 Derby contenders. I deal in results, not feelings." When they entered the isolation barn, Jason was mucking out a nearby stall. The young groom straightened as they approached, his expression changing from neutral to concerned when he saw Thornton's equipment. "Mr. Blackwell," he acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Is Mrs. Martinez coming today?" "Mrs. Martinez's services are no longer required," Travis replied coolly. "Mr. Thornton is taking over Midnight Storm's training program. He's one of the most respected trainers in the industry." Jason's eyes darted to the specialized equipment. "Sir, Midnight Storm has been making real progress with Mrs. Martinez. He's just starting to trust again. Changing approaches now might—" "That will be all, Jason," Travis interrupted sharply. "Return to your duties." In his stall, Midnight Storm stood alert, ears pricked forward at the sound of unfamiliar voices. Over the past weeks with Eleanor, his posture had gradually softened, his eyes losing some of their wild panic. Now, as Thornton approached, the horse's entire demeanor changed instantly, muscles tensing, nostrils flaring with the scent of a stranger. "Let's see what we're working with," Thornton said, stepping directly to the stall door with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Without the gradual approach Eleanor always used, he immediately reached for the latch. Midnight Storm's reaction was instantaneous and violent. Lunging toward the back of the stall, eyes rolling white with terror, a high-pitched whinny of distress echoing through the barn. "Classic dominance issue," Thornton assessed, unperturbed by the reaction. "He thinks he's in charge. We'll fix that quickly." He turned to his assistants. "Get the restraint gear. We'll need the modified halter and control rope." Within minutes, the assistants had gathered around the stall with an array of equipment that looked more appropriate for restraining a wild animal than training a traumatized horse. Thornton explained his approach to Travis as they prepared. "First, we establish physical control. Then mental submission follows. It's basic herd dynamics. He needs to recognize humans as the alpha presence. Thornton held up a specialized bit with long shanks. This provides enhanced control through pressure points. He'll resist at first, but they all surrender eventually. Jason, who had lingered nearby despite being dismissed, stepped forward again. "Mr. Blackwell, please. Mrs. Martinez said force would destroy all the trust he's built. He's not being dominant, he's terrified." Thornton scoffed. "Listen, kid. I've trained Triple Crown winners. This horse isn't special. He's just learned that acting out gets him attention." The confrontation that followed happened with frightening speed. Thornton and his assistants entered the stall using protective shields, attempting to corner Midnight Storm. The horse, faced with what his traumatized mind perceived as another deadly threat, responded with pure survival instinct, rearing, striking out with powerful hooves, eyes wild with panic. Thornton, despite his experience, misjudged the horse's reach. A flailing hoof caught his arm, tearing his expensive jacket and breaking skin. He stumbled backward, cursing loudly. "This animal is completely out of control," he shouted, clutching his bleeding arm. "He needs sedation and firm handling. Paren! Están destruyendo toda la confianza que hemos construido." The voice cut through the chaos like a beam of light through darkness. Eleanor Martinez stood in the barn doorway, her small frame vibrating with an authority that belied her physical frailty. Despite not being scheduled for a visit, she had felt a persistent unease all morning and decided to check on Midnight Storm. The scene before her confirmed her worst fears. Strangers with control equipment, Midnight Storm trapped in a corner, trembling with terror, his eyes searching desperately for escape. "Who the hell is this?" Thornton demanded, still clutching his bleeding arm. "Mrs. Martinez," Travis acknowledged stiffly. "This is a private training session. You weren't invited." Eleanor ignored him completely, moving slowly toward the stall with the same measured pace she always used. "Mi hermoso, estoy aquí," she called softly to the horse. "You are safe." Remarkably, at the sound of her voice, Midnight Storm's frantic movements stilled slightly. His ears, pinned flat against his head in terror, flickered forward briefly before fear overtook him again. "See," Thornton spat, pressing a handkerchief to his wound. "This animal is dangerous. He needs a firm approach, not lullabies in Spanish." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes flashing with an intensity that made the much larger man take an involuntary step back. "This horse is not dangerous. He is protecting himself from what he perceives as a threat, just as he did when he witnessed death in this very stall." By now, the commotion had drawn a crowd. Stable hands, exercise riders, and even some of the office staff had gathered at a safe distance. Among them, a clear division was forming. The older, more traditional staff nodding in agreement with Thornton's assessment, while younger workers, many who had witnessed Eleanor's progress, looked concerned. Jason stepped forward boldly. "Mr. Blackwell, in 3 weeks, Mrs. Martinez has accomplished more than all your specialists combined. Midnight Storm takes food from her hand now. He allows her to touch him. Before her, no one could get within 10 feet without risking their life." "Horses aren't pets, boy," retorted an older trainer. "They're athletes that need discipline and structure. These fancy new methods might look good on social media, but they don't prepare an animal for the track." The argument escalated, dividing the barn into 2 clear factions. Travis, visibly uncomfortable with the public disagreement among his staff, finally raised his hands for silence. "Enough. This is not a democracy. Blackwell Racing makes decisions based on results and timelines." He turned to Eleanor, his tone measured but firm. "Mrs. Martinez, while I appreciate your interest in Midnight Storm, we have professional protocols to follow. Mr. Thornton has prepared champions for 20 years, and I have healed broken horses for 50, Eleanor replied quietly. "But only one of us is listening to what this particular horse needs." The standoff continued until Travis finally suggested they move the discussion to his office. As Eleanor followed him across the grounds, she could feel the tension radiating from his rigid posture. Behind them, Stable hands were already spreading word of the confrontation throughout the property. Travis's office was a monument to equestrian success. Walls lined with photographs of winning horses, glass cases displaying trophies and ceremonial horseshoes. He settled behind his massive desk, with Eleanor, Thornton, and Hank Wilson taking seats across from him. "Let me be clear about our situation," Travis began, his tone clipped and businesslike. "The Derby qualification races begin in 8 weeks. Midnight Storm represents an investment of over $4 million, plus training costs. Every week he's not in proper training costs this operation significantly." "And what is the cost of his spirit?" Eleanor asked simply. "What price do you put on breaking him completely?" Thornton scoffed. "This isn't about sentiment, ma'am. It's about developing a valuable asset." "He's not an asset," Eleanor countered. "He's a being who witnessed death and carries that trauma in his body. Force him now, and you'll destroy everything we've built." Travis studied her thoughtfully, then made his decision. "I'm willing to compromise. Mrs. Martinez, you have 1 month. If Midnight Storm isn't ready for a professional rider by then, we return to conventional methods." His gaze hardened. "After that, we'll have to consider other options." The implied threat wasn't lost on Eleanor. In the racing world, horses that couldn't perform often disappeared into slaughter auctions, or were sold to lower-tier facilities with fewer ethical concerns. 1 month, she agreed, knowing it wasn't nearly enough time but unwilling to abandon Midnight Storm completely. As she left Blackwell Acres that afternoon, Eleanor felt a weight pressing against her chest that had nothing to do with her physical health. The morning's events had made clear the precarious nature of her position. She had no legal rights regarding Midnight Storm, no authority beyond what Travis temporarily permitted. Returning to Oak Ridge, her troubles only multiplied. The director was waiting in the lobby, holding an official-looking document. "Mrs. Martinez, this is a formal warning. Your unauthorized departures have been documented on 7 occasions now. 1 more instance, and we'll be forced to notify your children and implement mobility restrictions." Eleanor nodded mechanically, accepting the paper without reading it. In her room, she found a message from Maria asking why the facility director had called, expressing concerns about her erratic behavior. That night, as rain lashed against her window and thunder rolled across the Kentucky hills, Eleanor sat examining her old painting under the dim light of her bedside lamp. The Mustang's eyes seemed to watch her with understanding, a silent witness to her determination. "No te abandonaré, mi hermoso," she whispered to both the painted horse and the real one miles away. "I promise to save you, and I will." While the storm raged outside her window, Eleanor reached into her nightstand drawer and removed a small worn notebook covered in faded Spanish writing. Her father's journal containing Doma secrets never shared with outsiders, ancient techniques of Mexican horse whisperers that her great-grandfather had used to heal horses considered possessed on the ranches of Guadalajara. The worn leather journal felt almost alive in Eleanor's hands as she turned its yellowed pages by candlelight. The power had gone out during the storm, but she preferred it this way. The dancing flame illuminating her father's handwriting seemed appropriate for uncovering ancient wisdom. Miguel Martinez had documented generations of horse healing techniques passed down from his grandfather, who was renowned in Guadalajara as a curandero de caballos, a healer of horses deemed hopeless by conventional methods. "El caballo no es la enfermedad, sino el espejo," one passage read. "The horse is not the disease, but the mirror." Eleanor traced the words with her trembling finger, remembering how her father would whisper this teaching as they approached particularly troubled animals. The journal detailed specific pressure points, breathing techniques, and herbal preparations her ancestors had used. Most fascinating were the diagrams showing how a horse's body held trauma in specific muscle groups, knowledge that predated modern veterinary understanding by centuries. Eleanor practiced the hand movements illustrated in the journal, her post-stroke fingers struggling to form the precise shapes. One technique called El Abrazo Invisible, the invisible embrace, particularly captured her attention. It involved synchronizing one's breathing with the horses while standing in a specific position that created a sense of safety without physical contact. The horse must feel embraced without being constrained, her father had written. Freedom and security must exist together, or neither exists at all. By dawn, Eleanor had filled a small notebook with her own translations and adaptations of the techniques. Her medical training was limited to what she'd absorbed from veterinarians over decades of stable work, but she understood intuitively how to bridge her father's traditional knowledge with Midnight Storm's specific needs. When morning came, Eleanor carefully prepared a small sachet of dried herbs mentioned repeatedly in the journal: lavender, chamomile, and a specific variety of mint her father had called hierba del alma, soul herb. The combination wasn't meant as medicine, but as a familiar scent anchor that horses would associate with calm and safety. The director's warning echoed in Eleanor's mind as she slipped out of Oak Ridge that morning, but the fear of restrictions paled against her commitment to Midnight Storm. Some callings transcended rules and consequences. At Blackwell Acres, she found Jason waiting near the employee entrance, his expression brightening when he spotted her car. "Mrs. Martinez, I wasn't sure you'd come back after yesterday." Relief colored his voice as he hurried to help her from the car. "Some battles cannot be abandoned halfway, Jason," she replied, retrieving her painting and the small bag containing her father's journal and herbs. "Has there been any change?" Jason's expression darkened. "Thornton's assistants tried approaching him again this morning. It didn't go well. Mr. Blackwell ordered them to back off until your trial period is over, but they've been talking about sedation options." Eleanor nodded grimly. "Then we must work quickly. I will need your help today." Inside the isolation barn, Midnight Storm paced anxiously, his coat dampened with sweat despite the cool morning. When he spotted Eleanor, he stopped abruptly, nostrils flaring as he processed her familiar scent amid the lingering traces of strangers. "Buenos dias, mi corazón valiente," she greeted him softly. "I brought something special today." Rather than taking her usual seat on the bench, Eleanor whispered instructions to Jason, who helped arrange things differently. They positioned the bench closer to the stall, and Eleanor placed her painting facing Midnight Storm as always, but this time she stood beside it, embodying the posture shown in her father's journal. "What do you need me to do?" Jason asked quietly. "Watch and learn," Eleanor replied, slipping the small herb sachet into her pocket. "And keep others away. What happens now must happen without an audience." As Jason took up position near the barn entrance, Eleanor began implementing the techniques from her father's journal. She stood at an angle to Midnight Storm, not directly facing him, which could feel confrontational, but not with her back turned either. Her posture communicated both presence and respect for his space. Then she began controlling her breathing in a specific pattern: 4 counts in, hold for 7, 8 counts out, a rhythm her father had described as la respiración del potro dormido, the breathing of a sleeping foal. Horses were intensely sensitive to breathing patterns, Miguel had written. A human breathing like a relaxed horse communicated safety more effectively than any words. Minutes passed in this strange, silent communion. Midnight Storm watched her intently, his own breathing gradually slowing to match hers. Eleanor maintained the rhythm, occasionally humming a low 3-note melody that the journal described as El Llamado, the calling. After nearly 20 minutes of this seemingly passive interaction, Eleanor slowly reached into her pocket and removed the herb sachet, holding it in her open palm without extending it toward the horse. The subtle fragrance released into the air, creating an invisible cloud of calming scents. Midnight Storm's nostrils flared again, his ears pivoting forward with interest. Something in the herbal combination spoke to a deep, ancestral memory in his equine brain. These were scents that generations of horses had associated with healing and relief. Eleanor began speaking softly in Spanish, not the casual stories she had shared before, but the specific phrases her father had transcribed. Ancient words passed from horse healer to horse healer across centuries. Tu cuerpo recuerda el miedo, pero también recuerda la libertad, she murmured. Your body remembers fear, but it also remembers freedom. To Jason, watching from a distance, It appeared as though nothing significant was happening, just an elderly woman standing still, occasionally speaking or humming. But something profound was occurring in the silent language between species. After nearly an hour, Eleanor made the first direct movement toward Midnight Storm. Following the journal's guidance, she stepped sideways rather than forward, approaching the stall bars at an angle that felt less threatening to the horse. The magnificent animal tensed but didn't retreat. His eyes, still wary, remained fixed on Eleanor's face rather than her hands, a subtle but significant shift in focus that indicated decreasing fear. With her palm still holding the herb sachet, Eleanor extended her arm very slowly through the bars, not reaching for the horse, but simply offering the scent more directly. Midnight Storm stretched his neck cautiously, nostrils widening as he investigated this new element. The moment felt suspended in time. An elderly woman with trembling hands and a powerful horse traumatized by witnessing death, connected by invisible threads of understanding that transcended conventional communication. Then it happened. Midnight Storm took 2 deliberate steps forward and lowered his head slightly, bringing his muzzle within inches of Eleanor's outstretched hand. He didn't take the sachet, but his soft breath warmed her palm as he inhaled its scent deeply. "Muy bien, mi valiente," Eleanor whispered, tears welling in her eyes at this profound breakthrough. "Very good, my brave one." Jason, witnessing from afar, discreetly captured the moment on his phone, understanding its significance even if he didn't fully comprehend the methods. That evening, as Eleanor was leaving, Travis Blackwell intercepted her near the parking area, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Martinez, my staff tells me you've made some progress today." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "The progress belongs to Midnight Storm, not to me. I am merely opening doors he chooses to walk through." "Jason mentioned you're using some kind of traditional techniques?" His tone balanced between skepticism and reluctant curiosity. "Knowledge my father and his father before him carried from Mexico," Eleanor acknowledged. "Wisdom that predates your modern training manuals by centuries." Something shifted in Travis's expression, not quite respect, but perhaps the first crack in his certainty. "I still need results within our timeline. Healing follows its own clock, Mr. Blackwell, not yours or mine." Over the next several days, Eleanor implemented more techniques from her father's journal, each building upon the previous day's progress. She introduced a soft cloth scented with the herbs, which eventually became a bridge to physical contact. First the cloth touching Midnight Storm's muzzle, then her hand holding the cloth, then finally, on the 10th day, her bare hand making brief contact with his neck. Each success, however small, was meticulously documented by Jason, who had become not just an assistant, but a true believer in Eleanor's methods. His videos, shared with increasing frequency on social media, began attracting attention beyond the equestrian community. It was Jason who first noticed Melissa Chen, a young reporter from the Lexington Herald, lingering near the property entrance one afternoon. "She's been asking questions about you and Midnight Storm," he informed Eleanor during one of their sessions. "People are starting to talk about the Mexican horse whisperer all over Kentucky." Eleanor frowned slightly. "I didn't come here for attention, Jason." "Maybe not, but your methods deserve recognition," he insisted. "Do you know how many horses get destroyed because traditional trainers can't handle trauma? What you're doing could change everything." The following day, Melissa's article appeared on the front page of the local section. "Ancient Wisdom Meets Modern Crisis. Immigrant Elder Transforms Troubled Thoroughbred with Traditional Mexican Methods." The respectful piece detailed Eleanor's gentle approach and raised questions about conventional training techniques used on traumatized animals. Eleanor had just finished reading the article when her phone rang, her daughter Maria's number flashing on the screen. With a deep breath, she answered, "Mama, what is going on?" Maria's voice carried the sharp edge of professional concern. "The retirement home director called saying you're repeatedly leaving without permission, and now you're in the newspaper talking to horses." "I'm not talking to horses, Hia," Eleanor replied calmly. "I'm listening to them. There's a difference." The director says you could be endangering your health. Dr. Patel specifically said no driving, no stress. And what about my spirit, Maria? Should that wither away in that room while my body stays safe? The conversation continued in this vein, Maria's genuine concern battling with her frustration at her mother's apparent irrationality. It ended with Maria announcing that she and her brothers would be visiting that weekend to sort this situation out. Eleanor hung up feeling both dread and determination. Her children had never understood her connection to horses, had never wanted to hear her stories of famous thoroughbreds she'd helped or the wisdom she'd gathered over decades. To them, her work had always been just a job, an immigrant's necessity rather than a calling. That afternoon at Blackwell Acres, Eleanor achieved another breakthrough. Following a technique called La Confianza del Toque, the trust of touch, she was able to stand beside Midnight Storm inside his stall, her hand resting gently on his withers, while he remained calm and receptive. Jason captured this moment on video, his excitement palpable, even as he filmed quietly from outside the stall. "This is incredible," he whispered. 2 weeks ago, no one could get within 10 feet of him. News of Eleanor's progress spread rapidly throughout Blackwell Acres. Stable hands began appearing during her sessions, watching respectfully from a distance. Even some of the professional trainers who had initially dismissed her methods started observing with thoughtful expressions. That evening, when Eleanor returned to Oak Ridge, she found all 3 of her children waiting in her room, Maria looking concerned, Alejandro checking his watch impatiently, and Carlos scrolling through his phone. "This has to stop, Mama," Maria began without preamble. "The director showed us your file. Your blood pressure is up, you've missed physical therapy, and you're exhausting yourself with these horse visits. We're worried about you," Carlos added, looking up briefly from his phone. Eleanor regarded her children calmly. "For 50 years, I obeyed and remained invisible. Now, I have one last horse to save." "Mama, be reasonable," Alejandro sighed. "You're 68 with post-stroke complications. You can't be running around stables." Eleanor's patience finally reached its limit. "Come with me tomorrow," she challenged them. "See with your own eyes before judging me." The siblings exchanged surprised glances, clearly not expecting this response. "Actually see what you're doing with this horse?" Maria clarified. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "Judge after witnessing, not before." After a moment of silent communication between the siblings, Maria nodded reluctantly. "Fine, tomorrow morning. But if it seems dangerous in any way, this ends immediately." Eleanor smiled, feeling a strange sense of peace. Finally, her children would see the truth of who she was, not just their aging mother, but a woman with gifts and wisdom they had never bothered to understand. The following morning, when the luxurious SUV driven by Eleanor's eldest son parked at the gates of Blackwell Acres, they were greeted by an unexpected scene. A small crowd of people with cameras and a local news van. The story of the Mexican Whisperer had begun attracting attention beyond equestrian circles, and Travis Blackwell, visibly tense in his impeccable suit, was waiting to manage what he now realized was a potential public relations crisis. The glossy black SUV carrying Eleanor and her 3 children pulled through the gates of Blackwell Acres, the small gathering of reporters and cameras creating an unexpected welcoming committee. Maria, behind the wheel, shot a concerned glance at her mother. "What's all this, Mama? You didn't mention press coverage." Eleanor, seated in the passenger seat, appeared equally surprised. "I didn't invite them. The story seems to have spread on its own." As they parked, Eleanor spotted Travis Blackwell standing rigidly near the main stable entrance, his tailored suit incongruous among the working clothes of the stable hands. His face wore the carefully neutral expression of a man accustomed to managing public relations crises. "Mrs. Martinez," he greeted with forced cordiality as Eleanor and her children approached. "I see you've brought guests today." "My children," Eleanor replied simply. "They wish to see my work with Midnight Storm." Travis nodded stiffly, his attention divided between the Martinez family and the small media contingent now setting up cameras at a respectful distance. "I wasn't aware today would become a public demonstration," Before Eleanor could respond, a young woman with a press badge stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwell, Melissa Chen from the Lexington Herald. Our readers are fascinated by Mrs. Martinez's success with your horse. Would you care to comment on your innovative rehabilitation program?" Travis's expression shifted subtly, entrepreneurial instincts recognizing an opportunity within the challenge. "Blackwell Racing has always been at the forefront of equine care methodologies," he replied smoothly. "Mrs. Martinez's consultation is part of our comprehensive approach to rehabilitation." Eleanor's children exchanged skeptical glances, clearly noting the corporate appropriation of their mother's work. Maria, the eldest and most protective, stepped closer to Eleanor. "My mother isn't feeling well today," she announced loudly. "Perhaps this isn't the best time for cameras." "I'm fine, Hija," Eleanor countered firmly. "Midnight Storm is expecting me." The gathered crowd parted as Eleanor made her way toward the isolation barn, her children following with expressions ranging from embarrassment to growing curiosity. Inside, the usual stable activities had paused, with staff gathering discreetly to watch what had become the daily ritual of Eleanor's visits. Midnight Storm stood alert in his stall, ears pricked forward at the sound of Eleanor's voice, a dramatic change from the defensive posture he had maintained during her early visits. His dark eyes tracked her movement through the barn, intelligent and assessing. "He recognizes you," Carlos observed, genuine surprise in his voice. "Of course he does," Eleanor replied without turning. "We've been building trust for weeks." When they reached the stall, Eleanor's children hung back uncertainly, while she approached with her usual measured pace. The horse watched her intently, nostrils flaring slightly as he processed her familiar scent among the new ones accompanying her. "Buenos dias, mi hermoso," Eleanor greeted softly, her voice carrying the same gentle cadence she had used consistently in their sessions. "I've brought my family today. They wanted to meet you." Midnight Storm shifted his weight, muscles tensing slightly at the presence of strangers. His ears flicked back momentarily, not in aggression, but in uncertainty. "He's nervous," Alejandro remarked, instinctively stepping backward. "He's reading your nervousness," Eleanor corrected. "Horses mirror our emotions. Stand quietly and breathe normally." With deliberate calm, Eleanor unwrapped the colorful Mexican blanket she had brought, a family heirloom woven in vibrant reds and blues that had belonged to her father. The textile's bright patterns caught the attention of everyone in the barn, including Midnight Storm, whose ears immediately swiveled forward with interest. "What are you doing with that?" Maria asked, tension evident in her voice. "Building on our progress," Eleanor replied simply, holding the blanket so the horse could see and smell it from a safe distance. For several minutes, Eleanor simply stood there, allowing Midnight Storm to process this new element. Then, with movements so gradual they were almost imperceptible, she began to fold and unfold the blanket, creating soft sounds and gentle movements that would have terrified the horse weeks earlier, but now elicited curious attention. The gathered observers, including Eleanor's increasingly fascinated children, watched in silence as she conducted this strange, slow dance with fabric and stillness. Cameras clicked discreetly from the background. "May I enter?" Eleanor asked the horse, not the people, waiting for subtle signs of permission, a relaxed jaw, softened eyes, steady breathing. When Midnight Storm lowered his head slightly, she carefully opened the stall door and stepped inside, still holding the colorful blanket. Maria gasped audibly. "Mama, that's dangerous." Eleanor ignored the warning, her focus entirely on the communication happening between herself and the horse. Inside the stall, she continued the unhurried movements with the blanket, gradually bringing it closer to Midnight Storm's body without directly touching him. "He's not afraid of it," Jason explained quietly to Eleanor's children from where he stood nearby. "Your mother has been preparing him for this for days, introducing new textures gradually." The culminating moment arrived with breathtaking simplicity. With infinite gentleness, Eleanor draped the colorful Mexican blanket across Midnight Storm's broad back. The horse flinched slightly at the initial contact but remained standing, his trust in Eleanor outweighing the unfamiliar sensation. A collective gasp rose from the observers, followed by spontaneous applause. Flashbulbs captured the striking image. The magnificent black thoroughbred adorned with the vibrant traditional textile, standing calmly beside the elderly Mexican woman whose cultural heritage and personal connection had facilitated this breakthrough. For Eleanor's children, who had spent decades dismissing their mother's horse stories as exaggerations, the scene was transformative. They witnessed not an elderly woman with a hobby, but a skilled practitioner of an art they had never bothered to understand. Maria approached the stall cautiously, her professional composure momentarily abandoned. "Mama, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell us you could do this?" Eleanor's gaze remained on Midnight Storm as she adjusted the blanket. "I told you many times, Hia. You just weren't ready to hear." The moment was interrupted by Travis Blackwell's voice, now pitched to carry to the assembled media. "As you can see, Blackwell Racing's innovative rehabilitation program is making remarkable progress. Mrs. Martinez is helping develop our new approach before Midnight Storm begins his competitive training next month." Eleanor's head turned sharply at these words, her hands stilling on the blanket. Midnight Storm, sensitive to her sudden tension, shifted nervously beneath the colorful fabric. "Competitive training?" she repeated, carefully modulating her voice to avoid alarming the horse further. "He's nowhere near ready for that." "We have a timeline to maintain," Travis replied smoothly, maintaining his public smile. "The preliminary races for Derby qualification begin in 10 weeks. Eleanor carefully removed the blanket from Midnight Storm's back, patting him reassuringly before exiting the stall. She approached Travis, speaking low enough that only he and her nearby children could hear. "This horse isn't ready for intensive training. We're just beginning the real healing process." Travis's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. "I appreciate your contribution, Mrs. Martinez, but final decisions regarding my property are mine to make." The tension between them was palpable, a clash of fundamentally different values disguised as a professional disagreement. Maria stepped closer to her mother, protective instincts activated by the subtle power dynamic playing out. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately," she suggested, her corporate executive tone matching Travis's. "There's nothing to discuss," Travis replied dismissively. "We're grateful for Mrs. Martinez's assistance in the initial rehabilitation phase, but Midnight Storm's training schedule has already been determined." Eleanor stood very still, her expression shifting from concern to resolution. The gathered media, sensing conflict beneath the polite exchanges, moved closer, their cameras and recorders poised to capture whatever might unfold. "Then there is something everyone here should know," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying unexpected strength. She turned to Melissa Chen, beckoning the young reporter forward. "About Midnight Storm and about the Blackwell family legacy." "Mama, what are you doing?" Carlos whispered urgently. Eleanor ignored him, reaching into her purse to extract a carefully preserved photograph. The faded image showed a much younger Eleanor standing beside a distinguished-looking man in riding clothes, both of them with their hands on a magnificent black Mustang, whose resemblance to Midnight Storm was unmistakable. "This was taken in 1982, Eleanor explained, holding the photograph where Melissa and other reporters could clearly see it. "The man beside me is William Blackwell, Travis's father." Travis's carefully maintained composure faltered. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, reaching for the photograph. Eleanor kept it firmly in her grasp. "Your father and I shared a secret for many years, Mr. Blackwell," she revealed, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "Midnight Storm isn't just another thoroughbred. He carries the blood of the last wild black Mustang of Nevada, an animal that William Blackwell swore to protect, not exploit. A promise that his son is about to break." Silence fell over the gathered crowd as the implications of Eleanor's statement registered. Travis Blackwell stood frozen, his expression a complex mixture of shock, disbelief, and mounting anger. Maria stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on her mother's shoulder. For the first time in decades, she looked at Eleanor not as an aging parent to be managed, but as a woman with depths she had never bothered to explore. "Tell them everything, Mama," she encouraged softly. It's time they knew. Eleanor nodded, still holding the photograph where all could see it. The father of Travis Blackwell and I shared a secret for many years, she repeated for the benefit of the reporters now recording every word. Midnight Storm is not just another thoroughbred. He carries the blood of the last wild black Mustang of Nevada, an animal that William Blackwell swore to protect, not exploit. A promise that his son is about to break. The stunning revelation hung in the air like morning mist over Kentucky bluegrass. The photograph in Eleanor's weathered hand, showing her younger self beside William Blackwell and a magnificent black Mustang, had effectively silenced the gathered crowd. Travis Blackwell's face had drained of color, his carefully constructed corporate facade crumbling before the unexpected connection between his father and the elderly Mexican woman he had dismissed as inconsequential. By dawn the next morning, Melissa Chen's headline dominated the front page of the Lexington Herald. The Painting's Secret, the untold story of the Blackwell Empire. The article meticulously detailed Eleanor's revelations, how she, an undocumented immigrant teenager, had helped William Blackwell rescue an injured black Mustang during a Nevada desert storm in 1980, how they had developed an unlikely friendship based on mutual respect for horses, and how William had secretly used the Mustang's DNA to strengthen his thoroughbred bloodlines, creating horses with both the wild resilience of their desert ancestors and the speed of racing champions. Midnight Storm represents the culmination of William Blackwell's vision, Melissa wrote. A horse carrying the spirit of freedom within the body of a champion, a legacy now threatened by commercial interests. Travis Blackwell slammed the newspaper down on his mahogany desk, surrounded by his father's trophies and photographs. He had spent the night in a fury, combing through his father's private records, seeking evidence to refute Eleanor's claims. Instead, he had found cryptic references to the Nevada Project and photographs of horses bearing the distinctive star-shaped marking on their foreheads, the same marking Midnight Storm carried. "Get security on the line," he barked into his intercom. "I want that woman banned from this property, permanently." Across town, Eleanor sat at her small kitchen table in her children's apartment, the morning sunlight illuminating the newspaper spread before her. Maria poured coffee into 3 mugs, while her brothers read the article over Eleanor's shoulders. "This is incredible, Mama," Carlos said, his voice carrying newfound respect. "You actually saved a wild Mustang with William Blackwell himself?" Eleanor nodded, her fingers tracing the photograph reprinted in the newspaper. "Your grandfather would have been there too if he hadn't been deported the year before. He was the true horse healer in our family." Maria placed a steaming mug before her mother. "Why didn't you ever tell us the whole story? All these years we thought you were just—" She trailed off embarrassed. "Just a stable cleaner?" Eleanor finished gently. "I was that too, hija. There is no shame in honest work." "But you were so much more," Alejandro interjected, the corporate executive momentarily humbled by the revelation of his mother's hidden past. "You helped create a legacy." Eleanor took a sip of coffee, her eyes distant with memory. William understood something his son never learned, that the spirit of a horse is as valuable as its speed. When we found that injured Mustang in the Nevada desert, everyone said it would die, or if it lived, would be too wild to handle. But William saw something in its eyes. She paused, lost in recollection. "The same thing I see in Midnight Storm's eyes now." Their conversation was interrupted by Eleanor's phone ringing. Jason's worried voice came through the speaker. "Mrs. Martinez, you need to know. Mr. Blackwell has banned you from the property. There are security guards at every entrance with your photograph." Maria's protective instincts flared immediately. "This is outrageous. We should call our lawyer." But Eleanor remained calm, focusing on what mattered most. "How is Midnight Storm, Jason?" The young groom's voice lowered. "Not good. He keeps looking for you. Won't let anyone near him again, not even me. He hasn't eaten since yesterday." As Eleanor hung up, her children witnessed the transformation that had always eluded their understanding, their gentle mother becoming the fierce protector of a creature who couldn't speak for itself. They saw, perhaps for the first time, the woman who had survived crossing borders, losing parents, and decades of invisible labor while maintaining her innate dignity. "What are you going to do?" Carlos asked. Eleanor's answer was simple but resolute. "Whatever is necessary." By midday, news of Eleanor's banishment had spread throughout the Kentucky equestrian community. The story had struck a chord far beyond the racing world, touching on themes of immigrant contributions, animal welfare, and corporate ethics. Local television stations picked up the narrative, featuring interviews with veterinarians and horse behaviorists who validated Eleanor's gentle methods over traditional forceful approaches with traumatized animals. Outside Blackwell Acres, a small group of supporters had gathered by afternoon, mostly young stable hands from neighboring farms, animal welfare advocates, and a few older trainers who had always questioned conventional methods. They carried handmade signs, "Let Eleanor back," and "Horses need healing, not hurting." Inside the property, divisions among staff had deepened. Many of the older traditional trainers supported Travis, arguing that racing horses were investments, not pets. But others, particularly younger workers who had witnessed Eleanor's progress with Midnight Storm, questioned the ethics of reverting to forceful methods with a clearly traumatized animal. Jason became Eleanor's most vocal champion, risking his job by openly challenging decisions made by Thornton, who had returned to implement his aggressive training regimen. "This isn't about some old-fashioned superstition," Jason argued during a heated staff meeting. "It's about recognizing that trauma affects animals just like it affects people. Mrs. Martinez understood that. Why can't we?" That evening, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor at her children's apartment. Charles Wellington, a respected judge and influential figure in Kentucky's racing community. In his 70s, Wellington represented old money and traditional values. Yet he had requested this meeting after reading Melissa's article. "I knew your father, Mrs. Martinez," he said as he settled into an armchair. "Miguel had a gift few could understand. I see you inherited it." Eleanor studied him cautiously. "You knew my father." Wellington nodded. "I was a young attorney when he worked at Willow Creek Farm. I witnessed him calm a stallion everyone else had given up on." He leaned forward. "I also knew William Blackwell quite well. He never struck me as a man who'd break a promise, especially one made to preserve something he valued." Their conversation continued long into the evening, Wellington asking detailed questions about Eleanor's methods and her history with the Blackwell bloodline. As he prepared to leave, he handed her his card. "I sit on the board of equine welfare for the Kentucky Derby. I believe this situation warrants closer examination." Over the following days, the public pressure on Blackwell Racing intensified. Melissa Chen published a follow-up piece featuring interviews with former employees who confirmed the special relationship between William Blackwell and Eleanor. Social media campaigns gained traction with hashtags like "Let Eleanor Heal" and "Can Midnight Storm Matters." Throughout this growing controversy, Eleanor's primary concern remained Midnight Storm. Jason sent daily updates, each more worrying than the last. "He's refusing food completely now," Jason reported 5 days after Eleanor's banishment. "They tried to force a bit into his mouth today, and he nearly took down the stall wall fighting them." "Has he slept?" Eleanor asked, knowing sleep deprivation often accompanied severe equine distress. "Barely. He stands in the corner, watching the door. I think he's waiting for you." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of her children's apartment, staring at her painting of the Mustang. The resemblance to Midnight Storm was unmistakable. The same proud carriage, the same intelligent eyes that seemed to look beyond the physical world. "Lo siento, mi hermoso," she whispered, touching the canvas gently. "I have failed you." Maria found her mother still sitting there at dawn. Without words, she brought a blanket and draped it around Eleanor's shoulders, then sat beside her. "Is there any legal way to resolve this?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "Some document that might prove my connection to the bloodline?" Maria considered this thoughtfully. "If there was a formal agreement between you and William Blackwell, perhaps. But after so many years..." Eleanor's eyes widened suddenly. She rose, moving with unexpected swiftness to the painting. William gave me more than just this image, she said, turning the canvas over. On the back of the painting, previously unexamined, was a small metal plate with a miniature keyhole. With trembling fingers, Eleanor removed her necklace, revealing a tiny key pendant she had worn for decades, a key everyone had assumed was merely decorative. "He said to keep this safe," Eleanor murmured, inserting the key into the lock, "that someday it might matter." The metal plate opened to reveal a hidden compartment built into the frame. Inside lay a yellowed envelope, sealed with the Blackwell Racing crest. Eleanor's children gathered around as she carefully opened it, revealing a formally typed document on Blackwell Racing letterhead, dated June 12, 1982. "I, William Edward Blackwell, hereby acknowledge Eleanor Martinez's integral contribution to the preservation and development of the Nevada Black Mustang bloodline. In recognition of her special connection with these horses, I grant Eleanor Martinez lifetime advisory rights regarding the treatment and training of any direct descendants of the rescued Mustang, Spirit of Freedom." This bloodline, marked by the distinctive star pattern on the forehead, represents a commitment to preserving the wild spirit within our racing program. No horse of this bloodline shall be subjected to cruel or forceful training methods, in keeping with the natural respect approach demonstrated by Eleanor Martinez. The document was signed by William Blackwell and notarized properly, with a second signature from a witness, Charles Wellington. "This is why Wellington came to see you," Alejandro realized. He knew about this agreement. Maria, ever the pragmatic executive, was already analyzing the legal implications. This could potentially be enforceable, especially with Wellington's support. It's not ownership, but it establishes your right to be consulted on Midnight Storm's treatment. Eleanor held the document carefully, emotion overwhelming her. William had protected her connection to the bloodline all these years, anticipating a time when it might be threatened. "We need to contact our attorney immediately," Carlos suggested, already reaching for his phone. But Eleanor's attention had shifted to another item in the hidden compartment, a small photograph showing her beside the original rescued Mustang, the horse's head resting trustingly against her shoulder. On the back, in William's handwriting, "The true wealth of Blackwell Racing stands in this picture. Not the horses, but the trust between species that Eleanor makes possible." "In fact," Eleanor said slowly, turning her painting of the Mustang to face them, "William gave me something more than a painting. He gave me his written promise that the special bloodline would always be treated with respect, not as racing machines." Signed and notarized. The document in Eleanor's hands carried the weight of history and promise. As her children crowded around to examine William Blackwell's written guarantee, a new sense of determination filled the small apartment. This wasn't just a personal quest anymore. It was the fulfillment of a commitment made between two people who understood that some connections transcend business, class, and even species. "This changes everything," Maria said, already reaching for her phone. "I'll call Judge Wellington immediately." Eleanor nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the photograph of herself with the original Mustang. The animal's trusting posture spoke volumes about what had been achieved then, and what was at stake now. "Midnight Storm can't wait for legal proceedings," she said quietly. "Jason says he's stopped eating entirely." Alejandro frowned, the corporate executive in him automatically calculating time frames. Even with Wellington's support, getting an injunction could take days, possibly weeks if Travis fights it. "Then we don't wait," Eleanor declared, a steely resolve replacing her usual gentleness. "Tonight, I need to see Midnight Storm." Her children exchanged alarmed glances. "Mama, that's trespassing," Carlos warned. "You could be arrested." "Some risks are worth taking," Eleanor replied simply, turning to Maria. "Call Melissa Chen. Tell her to meet us at Blackwell Acres at midnight. And Jason, he needs to know we're coming." As darkness fell over Kentucky that evening, an unlikely operation took form. Eleanor's children, who had spent their lives in boardrooms and offices, found themselves planning what amounted to a covert infiltration of one of the state's most prestigious horse farms. Maria contacted Melissa, who immediately agreed to document whatever happened. Carlos researched the property layout, identifying a service road that saw minimal security patrols. Alejandro, surprisingly, revealed a pragmatic streak none of them had anticipated. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right," he announced, returning from a quick shopping trip with dark clothing for everyone and a first aid kit, just in case. By 11:30 that night, 2 vehicles approached Blackwell Acres from different directions. In Maria's SUV, Eleanor sat quietly in the passenger seat, her painting of the Mustang held protectively in her lap, the critical document secured in its hidden compartment. Following at a discreet distance, Melissa Chen drove with her photographer, their press credentials prominently displayed on their dashboard as a partial shield against immediate arrest. "Jason says the secondary maintenance gate will be unlocked," Maria whispered, as they parked in the shadow of a line of trees approximately 200 yards from the property's eastern boundary. "He'll meet us by the old equipment shed." Eleanor nodded, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. The night air carried the distinctive sense of Kentucky farmland, rich soil, hay, and the particular sweetness of thoroughbred stables. Even in darkness, she felt at home in this environment in a way her children could never fully understand. They moved silently through the fields, Eleanor leaning occasionally on Maria's arm when the uneven ground challenged her balance. The massive main house stood illuminated in the distance, but the stables where Midnight Storm was kept remained dark except for security lighting. Jason met them as promised, his young face tense with concern. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm so glad you came. It's worse than I told you on the phone. They tried sedating him today to force-feed him, but he fought so hard they had to stop." Eleanor's heart constricted at this news. A horse refusing food for this long wasn't just distressed, it was actively choosing to die rather than endure continued trauma. Such profound despair required immediate intervention. "Take me to him," she said simply. As they approached the isolation barn, staying in shadows to avoid security cameras, Eleanor reviewed her plan. She would need time alone with Midnight Storm, time to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by her absence and the renewed attempts at forceful training. Her children and Melissa would need to stand guard, warning of any approaching security personnel. What none of them anticipated was that someone would already be inside the barn. "I was wondering how long it would take you to try something like this." The voice emerged from the shadows as they entered, causing everyone to freeze. Travis Blackwell stepped into the pool of dim light, flanked by 2 security guards in Blackwell racing uniforms. "Trespassing is a serious offense, Mrs. Martinez," he continued, his tone cold with controlled anger. "One phone call, and you'll all be spending the night in county jail." Eleanor moved forward, her small frame somehow commanding the space between them. "I came to see Midnight Storm," she stated with quiet dignity. "What you're doing to him is cruel." "What I'm doing is business," Travis countered. "This horse represents a multi-million-dollar investment." "This horse is a living being who trusted me," Eleanor responded, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "You're destroying everything we built." Their confrontation was interrupted by a sound that chilled Eleanor's blood. A desperate, pained whinny from the far end of the barn. Midnight Storm, agitated by the familiar voice he had been waiting for, began striking violently against his stall walls, the impacts reverberating through the wooden structure. "See what your presence causes?" Travis accused sharply. "Weeks of professional training, ruined." "It isn't my presence disturbing him," Eleanor responded firmly. "It's what you've been doing to him." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the sudden flood of light that filled the barn. The main doors swung open, revealing a crowd of people standing in the entryway. Stable hands, journalists with cameras, and several distinguished-looking individuals Eleanor didn't recognize. Melissa Chen stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Mr. Blackwell, the public is questioning your methods after leaked videos showing Midnight Storm's suffering. Would you care to comment?" Travis's composure faltered momentarily as he realized the extent of the ambush. His eyes darted from the cameras to the unexpected witnesses. "This is private property. You're all trespassing and subject to prosecution. Perhaps we should discuss this in court," interjected a familiar voice as Charles Wellington emerged from the group. I have particular interest in hearing how Mrs. Martinez developed a connection that your specialists couldn't replicate. The elderly judge moved with deliberate dignity to stand beside Eleanor. I also have particular interest in a certain document that William Blackwell executed in 1982, a document I personally witnessed and notarized. Travis's face paled slightly. His security guards shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain how to handle this unexpected development involving one of Kentucky's most respected legal figures. "This woman has no qualifications," Travis attempted, gesturing dismissively toward Eleanor. "She's using my horse for publicity." "Qualifications?" The word escaped Eleanor as a half-laugh, half-indignation. Her voice, normally gentle, suddenly filled the barn with unexpected force. "I spent 50 years of my life caring for the most valuable horses in this state, always in the background, always invisible, because I had no documents. While men like you collected trophies, it was our hands that healed, that comforted, that built trust." Her words hung in the air, resonating with many of the stable hands who had worked their entire lives without recognition. Several nodded in silent agreement, their solidarity providing Eleanor strength. Throughout this confrontation, Midnight Storm's distress had continued to escalate. His panicked movements and labored breathing were audible even from a distance, the sounds of an animal pushed beyond its psychological limits. "Let me see him," Eleanor finally requested, her voice softening. "Just 5 minutes. If he rejects me, I'll never return." Travis surveyed the scene, cameras recording, Wellington's authoritative presence, the growing number of witnesses, and recognized he had few options. With visible reluctance, he nodded his permission. The crowd parted as Eleanor made her way toward Midnight Storm's stall. What she found broke her heart. The magnificent animal before her bore little resemblance to the horse she had begun to heal weeks earlier. His coat had lost its luster, his powerful frame showed signs of weight loss, and his eyes, those expressive windows she had connected with, darted nervously around the stall, reflecting a return to profound fear. "Hola, mi hermoso," she whispered in Spanish. "Te extrañé tanto." "Hello, my beautiful one. I missed you so much." For an agonizing moment, Midnight Storm remained at the back of his stall, regarding her with what appeared to be distrust. The weeks of separation and renewed traumatic handling had eroded the fragile bridge they had begun to build. Eleanor's heart sank as seconds stretched painfully, every eye in the barn fixed on this reunion. Then, with a fluidity that seemed to occur in slow motion, the magnificent black horse approached the front of his stall. He extended his muzzle and gently touched Eleanor's face, exhaling a deep breath that seemed to release weeks of tension. Cameras captured the moment as silent tears tracked down Eleanor's weathered cheeks. Without words, she turned her old painting of the Black Mustang, revealing for the first time what was written on its back, a dedication in elegant handwriting. "To Eleanor Martinez, guardian of free spirits, your kindness saved not only this Mustang, but my heart as well. With eternal gratitude, William Blackwell, 1982. Travis visibly paled as he recognized his father's signature. "Where? How did you get this?" he stammered. "Your father and I shared a secret for many years, Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor revealed with quiet dignity. "This painting contains documents on its reverse proving that Midnight Storm descends directly from a legendary wild Mustang we saved together, an animal your father promised never to exploit for money, but to protect for the free spirit it represented." The revelation fell like a bomb in the silent stable. Travis Blackwell, for the first time since taking over his father's empire, found himself truly speechless. The revelation hung in the air like morning mist over Kentucky bluegrass, transforming the atmosphere in the stable from confrontation to something more complex. Travis Blackwell stared at his father's handwriting on the back of the painting, recognition and disbelief battling across his face. For a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his business empire, this unexpected connection between his father and the elderly Mexican woman represented a narrative he couldn't easily dismiss. Charles Wellington broke the tense silence, his authoritative voice carrying the weight of his judicial background. "I suggest we continue this discussion in a more appropriate setting, Travis. Perhaps your conference room would be suitable." Travis nodded mechanically, still processing the implications of Eleanor's revelation. The main office, 20 minutes. He turned abruptly and strode out of the barn, his security detail following uncertainly. Eleanor remained beside Midnight Storm's stall, her hand resting lightly on his muzzle. "I need time with him first," she said firmly. Not a request, but a statement of fact. Wellington nodded. "I'll make sure you have it." With quiet authority, he began directing people out of the barn, suggesting that press representatives could gather at the main building for an upcoming statement. As the crowd dispersed, Eleanor found herself alone with Midnight Storm, Jason, and her children. The magnificent horse hadn't moved away from her touch, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that spoke volumes about his weeks of waiting. "Look at what they've done to you, mi valiente," Eleanor murmured, noting the dull coat and the tension still evident in his powerful frame. "But you held on. You remembered." Maria approached cautiously, seeing her mother through new eyes, not as a frail patient to be managed, but as a woman with profound gifts she had never bothered to understand. "He really does know you," she observed quietly. "Knowledge isn't just in the mind, Hisha," Eleanor replied, her fingers gently stroking the star-shaped marking on Midnight Storm's forehead, the genetic signature of his wild ancestry. "It lives in the body, in memory deeper than thought." While Jason prepared fresh water and feed, Eleanor began the process of re-establishing their connection. She hummed softly, the same melody she had used in their early sessions, her voice creating a bubble of calm that seemed to exclude the chaos of the past hours. Midnight Storm's breathing gradually synchronized with hers, a phenomenon that appeared almost mystical to her watching children, but represented a fundamental principle of Eleanor's approach, the communion of rhythms between species. 15 minutes later, when they made their way to the Blackwell Racing main office, Eleanor walked with renewed purpose. The painting she carried now represented not just personal history, but legal standing. The conference room presented a study in power dynamics, Travis at the head of the gleaming table, flanked by two men in expensive suits who were clearly attorneys. Wellington sat opposite, projecting calm confidence. Melissa Chen and several other journalists were permitted to remain, their recording devices capturing what was clearly evolving into a public reckoning. "Let's address the situation directly," Wellington began once everyone was seated. "The document Mrs. Martinez has preserved establishes her advisory rights regarding descendants of the Nevada Mustang bloodline. Midnight Storm, bearing the distinctive star marking, falls under this agreement." One of Travis's attorneys leaned forward. "A 40-year-old document with no witnesses to its creation beyond the signatory and Mrs. Martinez herself hardly constitutes—" "I witnessed it," Wellington interrupted mildly, "as the notary whose seal appears on the document. I was a practicing attorney before my judicial appointment." Travis drummed his fingers on the table, his expression calculating. "Even if this document has some historical validity, it doesn't grant ownership rights. Blackwell Racing maintains full ownership of Midnight Storm." "No one is disputing ownership, Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor replied calmly. "The agreement concerns treatment and training methods. Your father understood something fundamental about these horses. They carry both thoroughbred talent and wild spirit. Force destroys what makes them special." The meeting continued with technical discussions of legal standing and enforcement options. Wellington proposed an immediate independent veterinary assessment of Midnight Storm's condition, suggesting that evidence of declining health under current management strengthened Eleanor's position. Throughout the tense negotiations, Eleanor remained composed, occasionally offering insights about Midnight Storm's specific needs that demonstrated her deep understanding. Her children watched with growing respect as she held her ground against corporate lawyers, accustomed to intimidating opponents. "I'm prepared to take this matter before the Racing Commission," Wellington finally stated. "They take equine welfare violations quite seriously, particularly for horses slated for high-profile events." The implied threat of official investigation and potential public relations disaster hung heavily in the air. Travis studied Eleanor with new calculation in his eyes, recognizing that the elderly woman he had dismissed represented not just an inconvenience, but a legitimate challenge to his authority. "A week," he finally offered. "Mrs. Martinez can have 1 week of supervised access to demonstrate her methods. We'll have independent observers present." "With complete freedom to implement her approach," Wellington countered. "No interference from other trainers." After further negotiation, an agreement was reached. Eleanor would have 7 days of primary access to Midnight Storm, with qualified observers documenting the process. If improvement was demonstrated, a longer-term collaboration would be discussed. The following morning, Eleanor arrived at Blackwell Acres not as a trespasser but as an officially recognized consultant. The security guards who had previously barred her entry now nodded respectfully as she passed. News of the confrontation and subsequent agreement had spread throughout the property, creating a palpable shift in how she was perceived. In the isolation barn, now cleared of all equipment associated with Thornton's aggressive methods, Eleanor began implementing a comprehensive healing approach. She instructed the stable staff on specific bedding arrangements, feed mixtures, and environmental adjustments designed to reduce stress triggers. The physical space must feel safe before his mind can relax, she explained to the small group of observers that included Wellington, several veterinarians, and Travis himself, who stood at a distance with arms crossed defensively. Eleanor's methodology became clearer as the days progressed. Unlike conventional training focused on control and performance, her approach centered on rebuilding Midnight Storm's autonomy and confidence. She spent hours simply sitting nearby, sometimes reading aloud in Spanish, sometimes singing softly, always maintaining a consistent emotional presence that the traumatized horse could gradually internalize as safe. "She's not actually doing anything," Travis commented skeptically on the second day, watching Eleanor simply sitting on a stool near the stall, occasionally speaking to Midnight Storm in conversational tones. "On the contrary," responded Dr. Larson, an equine behavioral specialist from the university who had joined the observation team. "She's establishing consistent emotional availability without demand. Exactly what recent trauma research suggests is necessary for rebuilding neural pathways disrupted by extreme stress." By the third day, visible changes had begun to appear. Midnight Storm's coat regained some luster as he resumed proper eating habits. His posture shifted subtly, the constant tension in his muscles easing into more natural movement patterns. Most significantly, he began initiating contact with Eleanor, approaching her freely when she entered the stall rather than remaining fixed in defensive posturing. Travis, despite his initial skepticism, found himself increasingly drawn to observing these sessions. Something about the quiet interaction between the elderly woman and the powerful horse stirred fragmented memories of his childhood, of watching his father sitting similarly with special horses, demonstrating a patience that the young Travis had never understood or valued. On the morning of the 5th day, Eleanor arrived to find Travis already at the stable, reviewing charts that tracked Midnight Storm's vital signs and behavior patterns. "The improvement is measurable," he acknowledged reluctantly. "His cortisol levels have dropped significantly." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "Your father understood this approach intuitively. He called it listening with the whole body." Travis's expression shifted subtly. "You knew him well. We shared a vision of what horses could be when treated as partners rather than properties," Eleanor replied. "Something I believe you glimpsed as a child, before business became your primary focus." This simple observation touched something vulnerable in Travis. For a brief moment, his corporate facade slipped, revealing the son who had spent decades trying to live up to a father's legacy without fully understanding its deeper values. The most dramatic transformation occurred on the 6th day. Eleanor arrived with her colorful Mexican blanket, the same one Midnight Storm had accepted before their separation. With the observation team watching intently, she entered his stall and began the process of reintroducing the concept of carrying weight on his back. "The blanket represents connection, not control," she explained as she gently placed it across his withers. For his ancestors in the wild, carrying a rider was a partnership, not submission. Midnight Storm remained calm throughout this process, occasionally turning his head to observe but showing none of the panic that had characterized his previous experiences with training equipment. When Eleanor removed the blanket after a few minutes, she smiled at something she saw in his demeanor. "He's ready," she said simply. "Ready for what?" Travis asked from where he stood at the stall door. "To remember that trust can exist between species." On the morning of the 7th day, a small crowd gathered at the training paddock. Veterinarians, stable staff, members of the press invited by Wellington, and even several respected horse owners from neighboring farms who had heard about the remarkable rehabilitation taking place. Eleanor entered the paddock with Midnight Storm following freely behind her, no lead rope connecting them. The magnificent black horse moved with restored dignity, his coat gleaming in the morning sunlight, ears pricked forward with curiosity rather than pinned back in fear. With Jason's assistance, Eleanor placed the colorful Mexican blanket across Midnight Storm's back. Then, after a moment of quiet communication that seemed to require no words, Jason helped her mount, a moment that caused collective breath-holding among the observers. Riding without saddle or bridle, an elderly stroke survivor on a horse once considered too dangerous to approach, presented an image of profound trust that defied conventional wisdom. Midnight Storm stood perfectly still during this process, then began walking calmly around the paddock with Eleanor balanced on his back, her hands resting lightly on his mane. No commands were given, no control exerted, just two beings moving in harmonious understanding. As she completed a full circuit and Jason helped her dismount, Eleanor found Travis standing at the paddock gate, his expression transformed by what he had witnessed. The calculated businessman was temporarily absent, replaced by someone struggling to reconcile long-held beliefs with the undeniable evidence before him. "I think I finally understood what my father was trying to teach me all these years," he said quietly as Eleanor approached, his voice carrying only to her. Travis's quiet revelation lingered in the air between them. A fragile connection formed through the silent language that Eleanor had used with horses all her life. She regarded him thoughtfully, seeing for the first time not the ruthless businessman, but the son who had spent decades trying to embody a legacy he had never fully understood. "Your father believed that greatness emerges from partnership, not dominance," Eleanor said gently. "With horses, as with people." The crowd around them had begun to disperse, their excited conversations creating a buzz of energy across the paddock. Eleanor noticed Charles Wellington speaking with several influential horse owners, their animated gestures suggesting that Midnight Storm's transformation had made a significant impression. Journalists scribbled notes while photographers captured final images of the horse now grazing peacefully, the morning sun highlighting the distinctive star marking on his forehead. 1 week later, Travis Blackwell stood at a podium erected on the manicured lawn of Blackwell Acres, television cameras and a substantial gathering of media representatives arranged before him. Behind the podium, a new sign displayed the freshly designed logo for the Martinez Blackwell Equine Rehabilitation Program. "Blackwell Racing has always sought to balance tradition with innovation," Travis began, his corporate polish now tempered with genuine conviction. "Today, we honor my father's true legacy by recognizing that our responsibility extends beyond creating champions. We must be guardians of the spirit that makes these animals truly magnificent." Eleanor sat in the front row, flanked by her children and Jason, her weathered hands resting atop her cane. The past week had seen a whirlwind of negotiations, planning sessions, and heartfelt conversations that had resulted in this unexpected partnership. "Therefore, I am announcing that Midnight Storm will be temporarily withdrawn from racing competition for continued rehabilitation under the guidance of Eleanor Martinez, who is appointed as Blackwell Racing's special consultant for animal welfare." Applause rippled through the audience, particularly strong among the stable hands and trainers who had witnessed the remarkable transformation. Travis continued, outlining the establishment of a dedicated facility for traumatized horses, incorporating Eleanor's methods with modern veterinary care. For Eleanor, the public validation came decades late. After 50 years working in the shadows of Kentucky's racing industry, Her name was finally being spoken with respect by the very establishment that had long rendered her invisible. The irony wasn't lost on her 3 children, who watched their mother with newfound appreciation mingled with traces of shame for their previous dismissal of her horse stories. Later that afternoon, Maria approached Eleanor as she sat resting in the small apartment that Travis had ordered renovated for her use during her days at Blackwell Acres. "Why didn't you ever tell us, Mama?" Maria asked, genuine curiosity replacing her usual executive directness. Eleanor looked up from the tea she was stirring. "I told you many times," she replied without reproach. "You just weren't ready to hear." The simple truth hung between them. How often Eleanor had tried sharing stories of famous horses she'd helped, only to be met with distracted nods or changes of subject. Her children had been too absorbed in their upward mobility to recognize the wisdom their immigrant mother carried. "I'm sorry," Maria said softly, the rare admission reflecting her genuine regret. "We should have listened." "The past is behind us," Eleanor responded, patting her daughter's hand. "What matters is that you see me now." The Martinez-Blackwell Equine Rehabilitation Program took shape with remarkable speed. Travis, applying his business acumen to this new vision, secured partnerships with veterinary schools and animal welfare organizations. A former training barn was converted into a specialized facility with modified stalls, sensory-controlled environments, and spaces designed for Eleanor's unique approach. Jason, promoted to Animal Welfare Coordinator, became Eleanor's primary apprentice, meticulously documenting her techniques for future generations. Young trainers from across the country applied for internships, eager to learn methods that challenged conventional wisdom about problem horses. "You've started a revolution," Jason commented one morning as he assisted Eleanor with a newly arrived mare who had developed severe anxiety after a starting gate accident. "No, mihijo," Eleanor corrected gently. "I'm simply remembering what others forgot, that animals are not machines, but beings with spirits that can be broken or healed." Though Eleanor maintained her residence at Oak Ridge Retirement Home by choice, "I'm too old to manage a house alone." She spent 3 days each week at Blackwell Acres, dividing her time between Midnight Storm and the growing number of traumatized horses brought from around the country. The retirement home, now proud of their celebrity resident, arranged special transportation and adjusted her care schedule to accommodate her new role. The program quickly gained recognition beyond Kentucky. Universities with veterinary departments sent students for internships, and Eleanor found herself reluctantly conducting workshops for professional trainers eager to incorporate her methods. Articles appeared in equestrian journals with titles like "The Martinez Method," "Revolutionizing Trauma Recovery in Performance Horses," and "Ancient Wisdom Meets Modern Science in Breakthrough Equine Therapy." 6 months after the program's inception, Midnight Storm underwent his final transformation. The magnificent black horse, fully recovered from his trauma, allowed a young jockey selected by Eleanor to mount him for the first time. Rather than intensive race training, they began with slow morning rides that gradually evolved into more structured exercises. "He runs because he loves running now," Eleanor explained to Travis as they watched Midnight Storm's powerful strides during an early training session. "Not because he fears punishment." Travis nodded thoughtfully. "My father used to say something similar, but I never really understood until now." In an unprecedented decision, Travis announced that Midnight Storm would compete in a limited number of races, with special conditions to ensure his welfare. "This horse will race because he enjoys racing," he declared to skeptical industry insiders. "We're redefining what success means for Blackwell racing." The racing world scoffed at this approach, predicting failure for a horse trained with soft methods. Betting odds placed Midnight Storm as a significant underdog for his first race, the prestigious Carter Handicap at Aqueduct. On that crisp spring morning, Eleanor arrived at the track wearing an elegant traditional Kentucky Derby hat that Maria had insisted on purchasing for her. The stands buzzed with conversation about the miracle horse and his elderly Mexican trainer. Many had come specifically to witness what they expected would be either a remarkable triumph or a validation of conventional methods. "Nervous?" Travis asked as they watched the final preparations in the paddock area. "No," Eleanor replied simply. He is ready. Whether he wins or not doesn't matter. He has already conquered his greatest race. When Midnight Storm entered the starting gate, his demeanor differed noticeably from the other horses. While they pawed nervously or tossed their heads, he stood alert but calm, his focus clear. The distinctive star on his forehead caught the sunlight as the gates opened. The race unfolded like a physical manifestation of Midnight Storm's journey, starting cautiously, finding rhythm in the middle, and finishing with explosive power that seemed to emerge from joy rather than desperation. As he crossed the finish line a full length ahead of the favorite, the announcer's voice cracked with excitement. Midnight Storm takes the Carter Handicap. The comeback story of the decade is complete. The image of Eleanor Martinez being escorted by Travis Blackwell to the winner's circle became an instant classic in racing photography. The elderly Mexican woman in her derby hat beside the billion-dollar heir, both of them flanking a gleaming black thoroughbred whose intelligent eyes seemed to understand the significance of the moment. "What do you feel at this historic moment?" a reporter asked, thrusting a microphone toward Eleanor amid the celebration. "Gratitude," she answered simply, her hand gently stroking Midnight Storm's muzzle. "For this beautiful animal having taught me that it's never too late to begin again." Perhaps the most surprising legacy was the gradual transformation of Travis Blackwell himself. Influenced by Eleanor's simple wisdom, the businessman once obsessed with results began reevaluating his priorities. "My father tried to teach me that some things can't be measured in dollars," he admitted during an interview. "I needed Eleanor to finally understand the lesson." On Sundays, Midnight Storm participated in a special activity, visits to Oak Ridge Retirement Home, where elderly residents could interact with the famous horse in an adapted garden. For many, like Eleanor, contact with the animal awakened memories and emotions long forgotten. "See how he lowers his head for the lady with Alzheimer's?" Eleanor observed while instructing Travis, who frequently accompanied these visits. "He knows she needs extra gentleness." "How did you always know what they needed?" Travis asked, genuinely curious. Eleanor smiled, watching the golden Kentucky sunset illuminate the verdant fields where horses grazed freely. "When you're invisible for so long, you learn to observe. And when you observe with an open heart, you discover that all of us, humans, horses, everyone, desire the same thing: to be seen, respected, and loved for who we truly are." In the walls of the new wing of the Martinez Blackwell Equine Rehabilitation Center, the old painting of the Black Mustang occupied a place of honor. Beside it hung a recent photograph showing Eleanor mounted on Midnight Storm, gently galloping across Blackwell Acres fields, two once-broken souls now restored through a connection that transcended barriers of species, class, and origin. On the golden plaque beneath the images, a simple inscription summarized the extraordinary journey. "Algunos tesoros no pueden ser comprados." Some treasures cannot be bought.